So my name's Andre Fenton. I'm a professor of neuroscience here at the Center for Neuroscience at NYU. I study how memories get encoded in the brains of freely moving rats and such. Not very close to anything moral, I would argue. But it is my pleasure to introduce to you Molly Crockett. I'll read a little bit about Molly and tell you a little bit about her work. She's right now is a Sir Henry Wellcome Postdoctoral Fellow studying the neurobiology of morality and altruism. And I should point out this is a very prestigious postdoctoral fellowship that she holds. And in her own words, it's an awesome deal, possibly the best postdoc deal available. And that's in large part because it allows her an enormous amount of breadth and flexibility in choosing what it is that she's going to focus on and where she focuses her attention. So she originates from Southern California, where she studied psychology as an undergrad at UCLA. And her interest in brain chemistry led her to the University of Cambridge, where she took her PhD with Trevor Robbins, an esteemed neuroscientist there. She completed her PhD there as a Gates Scholar. Right now she's collaborating with scientists at the University of Zurich, where I believe she's based, and University College London, a team there that's been making important inroads in understanding the neurobiology of decision-making. And she's going to tell us today about morphing morals, neurochemical modulation of moral judgment and behavior. And I should just tell you that she's more or less one of the few experts in how, let's not call it diet, but how certain substances, for example, tryptophan, something that you eat and get in your red meat, how that gets converted to serotonin and can affect mood and apparently also perhaps moral judgments. Thank you.
So can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me, especially Matthew. It's been really fascinating couple of days, and to add to the mix by telling you a bit about brain chemistry. So I got sort of interested in this question of how different chemical processes in the brain can influence our decision-making by pondering the following situation. So here we are in New York. There are lots of homeless people around, potentially asking you for money. So first of all, I'd like to see a show of hands if you've ever given money to a homeless person. Okay. Keep your hand raised. Okay, keep your hands raised. Keep them raised if you're a philosopher. Okay, that's actually pretty good. So when I give this talk, when there are economists in the audience, all the hands go down. I'm working with economists right now in Zurich. They're an exciting bunch. No, I've been learning a lot actually. A slightly different question. So raise your hands again if you've given money to a homeless person, and keep your hand raised if you've given money to every single homeless person you've ever encountered. Right, okay. So the point here is that even though we sometimes feel motivated to help our fellow man, we sometimes do and we sometimes don't. This tendency differs both between individuals, but it also differs within individuals. And I've been really interested in the brain systems that can sort of mediate both between and within individual differences in altruistic and moral behaviors as a sort of broad category, with all due respect to Walter, of course. So this question sort of led me to the neuromodulatory systems in the brain, which there are four major ones, including Noradrenaline, serotonin, acetylcholine, and dopamine. And of course, hormones like testosterone and oxytocin can also serve as neuromodulators. These chemical systems sort of spread all throughout the brain and have really kind of global, large-scale processing influences on brain activity in, of course, various situations. So I'll just sort of go through the plan here. I'm going to first sort of talk about very broadly at the molecular level how these systems work, just to sort of give you an idea of what kinds of brain systems and brain processes are going on when I talk about neuromodulation. And then I'll focus on some studies that we've done looking at how neuromodulators, specifically serotonin, shape moral judgment and behavior in the domains of harm or care-based morality, as well as fairness and reciprocity. So the idea that chemical solutions can influence our moral behavior is not a new one, and in fact was quite explicitly and elaborately reflected upon in the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where the upstanding citizen Dr. Jekyll drank a mysterious potion, which then transformed him into the murderous Mr. Hyde, which had sort of bad consequences for a lot of people involved. And of course, we've learned a lot about how the brain works since this tale was written, and we're getting a better idea as to sort of how chemical substances can influence decision-making, both moral and non-moral. So what exactly am I talking about when I talk about neuromodulation? So here are two neurons. This gap between them is called a synapse. Here we have some neurotransmitters, this might be glutamate or GABA, stored in this one synapse. And to transmit a message across the synapse, this one neuron must release the neurotransmitters into the synapse, where they bind to receptors on the next neuron and propagate the message across. So this is sort of your bog standard, basic neurotransmission process. This is how information is processed in local circuits around the brain. When I talk about neuromodulators, I'm talking about a top-down broad chemical influence. So you could have this other neuron here that contains a neuromodulator, like serotonin, for example. It binds to a receptor here, which then modulates how this signal is transmitted. So it might enhance the signal, for example, or in another circumstance, with a different type of receptor, perhaps, it might reduce or sort of dampen the signal that gets transmitted. So we're really talking about a top-down modulation of an ongoing information processing sort of computation when we talk about neuromodulation. And like I said before, there are a bunch of different neuromodulators in the brain. They've all been associated with sort of both distinct but also overlapping processes. In our work, we sort of zoomed in on serotonin for several reasons. The main reason being that of all these systems, serotonin is the most strongly implicated in lots of different aspects of social behavior, particularly pro-social behavior. So if you're looking for a brain chemical that's likely to modulate things like altruism, cooperation, harm or care-based morality, serotonin is a really, really good place to start. So we began to sort of answer this question with a series of studies in humans where we manipulated the various aspects of the serotonin system and looked at how moral judgment and moral behaviors, so behaviors that are relevant for morality, are affected by these causal manipulations of the serotonin system. So one study that we did looked at moral judgment in the domain of harm and care. So as we heard yesterday, for example, by James Blair, humans have a sort of aversion to harming other people that seems to be quite instinctual. So this is a really nice study by Byron Cushman and colleagues demonstrating that actually our aversion to harm does infuse our moral judgment. So what they did was they showed people, I think these were actually live demonstrations of various harmful acts, and they measured people's physiological reactivity to witnessing these harmful acts, and compared the physiological activity of these harmful acts with sort of baseline control situations where the sort of visual, perceptual features of the acts were held constant, but there was no harm involved. And what they found was that the more aroused people felt by watching these harmful acts, the more likely they were to sort of subscribe to deontological views when reasoning in trolley problems. So as the problems that we've heard so much about, I'm jumping on the bandwagon as well, that people who were more aroused to witnessing harms were sort of less likely to say it's okay to push the fat man off the bridge to stop the trolley. So there were a bunch of studies showing that both in humans and in primates, that if you give serotonergic substances, that this can sort of shape social behavior and aggression. But what seems to be lacking from this literature were studies that were aimed at getting at both the cognitive processes involved, the emotional processes involved, and also sort of a more quantitative measure of how these behaviors change on the influence of these treatments. So in one study, we looked at how sort of harm aversion in the domain shaped by a drug acting on the serotonin system. So I don't really have to spend a lot of time talking about these. Thanks to everyone who went before me. We compared moral judgment in these impersonal trolley problems with personal trolley problems. When subjects were on one of two drugs, we gave them a serotonin drug, citalopram, it's an SSRI. Basically, when serotonin is released in the synapse, like I showed before, it binds to these postsynaptic receptors and activates this next neuron in various ways. After serotonin is released, there's this transporter, which is basically like a molecular vacuum cleaner. It sucks the serotonin back up into the presynaptic neuron where it's metabolized and discarded. This drug, citalopram, blocks the vacuum cleaner, so serotonin has more time to hang out in the synapse and activate the next neuron. So we looked at this sort of serotonin-enhancing drug and compared it with a noradrenaline-enhancing drug, atomoxetine, which works in the exact same way as citalopram, just on noradrenaline cells as opposed to serotonin cells. We looked at how these two drugs compared with placebo on moral judgment and judgment in neutral scenarios. So this is the data from the neutral scenarios, and yeah, basically there's no appreciable differences between the different treatments, which is good because we want to rule out effects on judgment, things like reading comprehension, working memory, so on and so forth. Similarly, we didn't find any distinctions between the different treatments on moral judgment in the impersonal cases. So, for example, the switch dilemma, where you can harm one to save many others by flipping a switch. But in the personal cases where the harms that achieved greater benefits involve these sort of visceral, emotional, sort of me, hurt, you kind of processes in which we think that harm aversion is going to play a very strong role. This is where we see the effects of the drug, specifically citalopram, which makes people less likely to say it's okay to push the fat man off the bridge to save the five. And this is in relation to both atomoxetine, the noradrenaline drug, as well as the placebo treatment. We also looked at how the drug interacted with individual differences in something like empathy. So we're interested in how serotonin impacts something like harm aversion and its effects on moral judgment. We might expect that individuals who might show a stronger baseline harm aversion response to begin with could be more susceptible to the effects of the serotonin drug. And indeed, that's what we found. So we split our subjects into low and high empathy individuals, which we measured using a separate scale, the interpersonal reactivity index. There's no significant effects of the drug in the low empathy folks, and our effect in the group is really driven completely by the high empathy subjects, such that if you're high empathy and you get citalopram, you're the least likely to endorse harming one to save many others. So we also looked at the effects of serotonin manipulations on moral judgment and behavior in the domain of fairness and reciprocity. And that's actually the bulk of the work that I've done, and spend the rest of the talk talking about that. So as Paul Bloom showed us so nicely earlier today, humans care very deeply about fairness from a very young age. We endorse egalitarian norms, equal splits. So much so that we're even willing to accept personal costs in order to endorse these fairness norms and in order to enforce fairness norms. So incurring a cost to enforce a social norm of fairness we call costly punishment, or sometimes informal sanctions. These are ways that we gently remind our neighbors that what they've just done is not cool. So it might be a minor violation, like maybe they've parked their car in the wrong spot. Or it could be something a bit more serious, like manipulating the government to rig the financial system in your favor and costing the public billions of dollars. So regardless of the transgression, it has been shown in lab settings, for example, that costly punishment of self-interested behavior can help to restrain that self-interested behavior. So in some now famous experiments using public goods games, Ernst Fair and colleagues showed that when you get people to cooperate in a situation where you can be punished for selfish free-riding behavior, cooperation is much more stable than if punishment is not possible. So this idea that we enforce fairness norms by punishing them is one that's really gained a lot of traction in the behavioral sciences and when we think about sort of how cooperation could have evolved. So in our studies, we looked at one form of costly punishment. We used a setup called the ultimatum game. This has two players, a proposer and a responder. They have to agree on how to split this stake, or neither of them gets anything. So the proposer makes an offer to the responder. The responder can either accept the offer, in which case both players are paid accordingly, or he can reject the offer, in which case neither player is paid. Now, of course, anyone motivated solely by self-interest will accept any offer because something is better than nothing, but it's been shown time and time again that many people would rather have nothing than let the proposer get away with taking the lion's share. So we are interested in how this costly punishment behavior, rejecting an unfair offer in the ultimatum game, would be sensitive to manipulation of the serotonin system. So in our first study, we used a technique called acute tryptophan depletion, which temporarily lowers the amount of serotonin that's available to the brain. It's a dietary manipulation, and it works as follows. So we get our subjects to fast from the night before. This technique takes advantage of the fact that the raw ingredient for serotonin is the amino acid tryptophan, which can only be obtained through the diet. So if you get subjects to fast for several hours, and then you bring them into the lab, and you give them a mixture of powdered amino acids flavored with lemon lime flavoring, it's really, really disgusting, so I don't recommend you participate in a tryptophan depletion study. No, actually, some people don't find it that bad. But anyhow, tryptophan competes for access to the brain with other amino acids that you get in your diet. They all compete for access through the blood-brain barrier. And there's sort of limited space to get through. So if you give subjects a drink that has all of the large neutral amino acids except for tryptophan, then this influx of other amino acids makes it harder for any sort of residual tryptophan that's left over in the bloodstream to get into the brain. So after they take this drink, about 5 hours later, you can observe the brain in a low serotonin state. And you compare this to a placebo treatment, which looks and tastes exactly the same. The only difference is about 3 grams of powdered tryptophan that is present in the control drink. And this sort of preserves the ratio of tryptophan to the other amino acids to sort of mimic how biochemistry is taking place under a normal diet. So we give people this treatment. 5 hours later, we can compare behavior on the depletion day to behavior on the placebo day, and look at how people behave when they have low serotonin in their brain. So we used a setup of the ultimatum game that looked basically like this on the computer. They saw a photograph of the proposer and the amount of the stake, and then the amount that the proposer had offered them. While the offer was on the screen, they could accept or reject the offer. This all took place pretty quickly, and they went through a series of one-shot games, which is important. So they only interacted with every single proposer one time, which we do to rule out sort of strategic considerations. Because if you're in a repeated interaction with someone, it actually makes sense to reject low offers at the outset, because this could sort of induce them to be nicer to you in the future. And this is, of course, one reason why people punish, but it's also been demonstrated that people punish unfairness even if there's no chance that they're ever going to interact with the perpetrator again. And that was the process that we were interested in capturing in this study. So these were one-shot situations. We randomly paired the photographs with the offers, so there could be any sort of person effects. And subjects were told that one of these would be randomly selected and actually paid out to them and the proposer on the basis of their decision. So what we found, this is the data from the placebo session, and just like hundreds of other studies have shown, when the offers are unfair, the proportion of those offers rejected is very high. Fair offers of 45 to 50% of the stake are rarely rejected. And when we deplete serotonin, when we deprive the brain of serotonin, rejection goes up for particularly the unfair offers, also these median ones, to a more variable without affecting the fair offers. So that was sort of one demonstration that lowering serotonin could influence costly punishment behavior. In our second study, we wanted to sort of test the limits of this process in a couple of ways. So first of all, we wanted to see whether we could push behavior in the opposite direction by enhancing serotonin rather than depleting it. For this, we gave citalopram, the SSRI, which I told you about before. We were also interested in the extent to which this process is sort of specific to manipulating serotonin rather than just manipulating any brain chemical, because as I mentioned at the beginning, these chemical systems in the brain do have sort of some overlapping features, and particularly how they respond to arousing events in the environment. So we compared the effects of atomoxetine, the Noradrenaline drug, on costly punishment behavior in the ultimatum game. So here's the data from the placebo session. It's very similar to what we saw with the first study. Again, as offers are unfair, the proportion of those offers that are rejected is quite high, and this declines nicely as fairness increases. Our atomoxetine drug had no appreciable effect on decision-making in the ultimatum game relative to placebo. Citalopram reduced rejection, particularly at this middle level of unfairness, sort of mirroring the pattern we saw in our first study. And it's important for me to point out, actually, with both this data as well as the moral judgment study, it's not that atomoxetine was completely inert in this study, because we had some other measures of attention and sort of impulsivity and self-control. And atomoxetine actually improved performance on those measures. So on a task where you have to sort of pay very close attention to letters on the screen and press a button when certain letters come up, atomoxetine dramatically improves your performance on that kind of a task, but doesn't affect your behavior on more emotional and moral tasks involving decision-making where there are other people involved and where there's emotional processing involved. The other important thing I should point out is that we're very careful to control for things like changes in mood or side effects like nausea that people might experience in these studies. Contrary to sort of, I think, folk accounts of serotonin, there's not actually a straightforward relationship between serotonin function and mood. If you have a history of depression, then something like tryptophan depletion can put you in a low mood, but we're very careful to exclude people with any sort of psychiatric history from these studies. So when we measure mood in all these studies, our subjects can't tell what treatment they're on. They don't feel sort of grumpy or overly happy. The sort of perceptual differences from the point of view of the subject, whether they're on placebo or whether these treatments, is indistinguishable. They really can't tell, and yet their behavior has changed in these non-trivial ways. So after we'd done these first couple of behavior studies, we sort of took stock of sort of what we had found, as well as comparing these findings to what others had found. And I was particularly sort of struck by some conversations I had with an economist, Benedict Herrmann, who came up to me after a conference once, after I presented these data, and said to me, the ultimatum game is not about fairness. And I said, well, what do you mean? Of course it's about fairness. And through a series of conversations, we sort of changed my thinking a little bit, and made me sort of consider the possibility that punishment of unfair behavior in certain cases can be motivated more by sort of harmful kinds of motives as opposed to fairness motives. So I'll sort of go through a few examples of evidence, I think, that point to this. So just to recall sort of what we found, when we give people citalopram, they reject fewer of these unfair offers. And they also endorse fewer personal harms. And this pattern of results is mirrored by those found in patients with damage to the ventral medial frontal cortex in the opposite direction. So unlike people on citalopram, PMPSC patients reject more unfair offers, and they endorse more personal harms. And we also see this sort of general pattern in psychopaths. So psychopaths also reject more unfair offers in an ultimatum game, and they endorse more personal harms. So considering all of this evidence together, we sort of became more interested in understanding how serotonin influences punishment behavior via its impact on motives for punishment. And this is actually really important, and I think illustrated very nicely by Tamara in her talk, which is the sort of thought processes that cause you to arrive at a particular behavior, like pushing a guy off a bridge, are actually important for a moral evaluation of that agent. So if you're really conflicted about it and going through this reasoning process and you push the guy off the bridge, that's sort of more morally acceptable than if you do it while laughing and very impulsively or even sadistically. And so we sort of designed some studies to try and get at how serotonin is shaping punishment behavior, whether that's via more altruistic motives to enforce a social norm of fairness, or from something considerably darker, which is motives for revenge and actually wanting to harm the person who's behaved unfairly towards you. So we used a combination of sort of behavioral and neuroimaging methods in this third study to try and uncover the processes, the motivational processes that play out when we manipulate serotonin and see an impact on punishment behavior. So what kind of pattern of brain activity might we see if serotonin depletion is increasing punishment behavior via an impact on revenge motives? Well, first of all, there are a few studies showing that when you allow subjects to punish, for example, you see activation in the caudate nucleus, which is a part of the striatum involved in a lot of different motivational processes, including prediction of reward that come about through your own actions. Another study looked at how subjects respond. It's actually a really cool study by Tom Singer. In the first phase of this study, they had subjects playing economic games. I think they were ultimatum games with other players, and the other players could be nasty or they could be nice. And then in phase 2, the subjects were in the scanner as they viewed the nasty and nice players receiving electric shocks. And what they found was that when subjects viewed the nasty players getting electric shocks, they showed activation in the nucleus accumbens, another part of the striatum implicated in reward processing. And this activation correlated with subjects' self-reported desire for revenge. So if depleting serotonin is enhancing punishment behavior via a modulation of sort of motives for revenge and to harm the other person, we might see increased activation in the striatum when subjects are punishing, when they're rejecting unfair offers under the influence of tryptophan depletion. And that's exactly what we find. So this is increased activation in the caudate when subjects are rejecting unfair offers. That is enhanced on tryptophan depletion relative to placebo. And if you look at individual differences in this gap here, so the extent to which our chemical treatment increases signal in this region when subjects are rejecting, this actually predicts the effect of the treatment on their behavior. So the more signal in this region is boosted when subjects are rejecting, the more the treatment actually makes them reject more, suggesting that this region could be playing a causal role in mediating the effects of a serotonin manipulation on punishment behavior. So that's one side of the story, but just because serotonin depletion is influencing costly punishment via revenge motives doesn't rule out the possibility that it's also making people care more about unfairness and fairness and influencing behavior through that route as well. So what might we want? What kind of processes might we look for if serotonin depletion is working on fairness motives? Well, so this is a study by Goldberg using a very, very similar ultimatum game task that we use. They compared neural responses to fair offers with neural responses to unfair offers that are matched for material value. And this is really important because we know that these brain regions that are involved in reward processing do respond to differences in money. So they were interested in how responses to a fair offer differs from responses to an unfair offer, sort of over and above any differences in the amount of money that you're receiving. And what they found is indeed that these brain regions that have been implicated in various aspects of motivation and reward processing show stronger activity to fair offers versus unfair offers that are matched for material value. So if serotonin depletion is increasing punishment by making people care more about fairness, then we might also see an enhanced activation in these regions on depletion when subjects are considering fair offers. And what we find is precisely the opposite. So lowering serotonin actually blunted fairness motives or responses in these motivational brain regions to fair offers. So this is signal in the ventral striatum. On placebo, you can see it's going crazy when it gets a fair offer relative to an unfair offer. And tryptophan depletion just blunts the response of this region to fair offers. This is quite interesting when you consider that depression is associated with low or impaired serotonin function and is also associated with anhedonia, or a lack of pleasure to rewards that sort of normally cause great pleasure. So what we see is actually a blunting of responses in these motivational systems to fair offers when you lower serotonin. And indeed, we also see a similar pattern in the medial prefrontal cortex. This is sort of dorsomedial, a region that has been implicated in a lot of things. It's been implicated in sort of mentalizing, thinking about others, but also thinking about yourself, as well as sort of predicting rewards in more abstract contexts. And when we lower serotonin, this region, which normally responds a lot to fairness, is blunted as well. Even sort of goes in the opposite direction, but that's not significant. So this is actually quite surprising to us. And we had a piece of behavioral evidence that corroborated the story that serotonin is having a sort of bidirectional influence on sort of harm-based revenge motives as well as fairness motives. So we reason that if subjects are punishing on the basis of fairness and serotonin is influencing their punishment behavior via fairness motives, you should see a similar effect of serotonin depletion on third-party punishment, where instead of asking people if they want to punish someone who's behaved unfairly towards them, we ask if you want to punish a proposer who's behaved unfairly towards someone else. So in this task, we showed subjects photographs of proposers and responders. We gave them £5 and allowed them to spend up to 50p to reduce the payoff of the proposer. The responder in this case wasn't able to accept or reject the offer, so these are basically dictator games with third-party punishment. And it's important to point out that we ruled out any motivations for status because our subjects always had more money than these two, regardless of sort of what decision they made. So this is the data from placebo, and even though they had absolutely no stake in the transaction, our subjects did spend about 30p to punish proposers who were unfair, and they never punished proposers who made fair offers to the other guy. Now keep in mind, if serotonin depletion is increasing second-party punishment in the ultimatum game, sort of through fairness motives, then you should also see an increase in third-party punishment. The two should sort of go together. If, however, the effect of serotonin depletion is sort of by unleashing these harmful revenge motives, these revenge motives don't really play much of a role in third-party punishment. And finally, the third piece of the puzzle, the sort of third possibility, is we saw in the brain data on the ultimatum game that when you deplete serotonin, people care less about fairness. So they might punish less on tryptophan depletion if third-party punishment is a sort of fairness-based punishment. And what we found is the third option. So while the same treatment in the same subjects makes people reject more unfair offers in an ultimatum game, it makes them punish less in a third-party situation, which fits with our brain data showing that when they're rejecting in the unfair situation in the ultimatum game, they show increased activity in motivational structures like the caudate, but reduced activity in similar rewards processing structures when they're getting fair offers. So this set of studies was quite surprising to us, but we've sort of taken a step back and sort of thought about how it all fits together. So we found that serotonin modulates various aspects of moral judgment and behavior, both through sort of influencing aversion to harm, but also by modulating preferences for fairness. And sort of putting it all together, I started to wonder whether we could sort of subsume this all into a more general role for serotonin in care-based morality, And by care-based morality, I mean caring about the outcomes of others, so social preferences more generally, and how we place a value on what happens to our interaction partners, to other people out in the world. So evidence for this comes from the fact that impaired serotonin function is associated with aggressive behavior, whereas intact or even enhancing serotonin promotes pro-social behavior. And there's another piece of this puzzle which I haven't mentioned in the interest of time, but there's also a huge literature showing that serotonin is involved in self-control. So by promoting sort of long-term thinking and sort of choices that promote your well-being in the future. And so it's unclear how this would really fit into a concept of care-based morality, unless you consider some really interesting studies that have come out recently suggesting that self-control is to a certain degree modulated by your relationship with your future self. So the extent to which you can empathize with your future self and sort of consider the thoughts and feelings of your future self, the more self-controlled you are in making decisions about sort of investment or saving money. So in that way, you can sort of subsume moral virtues like industry, like sort of self-control, into this more social concept of care-based morality, in which serotonin seems to play a common role. So the last bit of this thinking that I've sort of been putting together is how serotonin could play a role in the context sensitivity of our morality. So there's another whole set of studies showing that serotonin levels and serotonin function in the brain is sensitive to a number of environmental variables, including but not limited to competition, stress, status, and social deprivation. And you can imagine that a care-based morality system or social preferences should be adaptive to your state in the world, because if there are a lot of resources available, for example, it makes sense to share because there's plenty to go around and you should share. But if there are limited resources, selfishness could be a more adaptive strategy in terms of propagating your genes into the next generation. So that's sort of where it all leads off, and there's a whole bunch of stuff I could have presented on sort of not work that I've done, but there are of course other neuromodulators that are involved in all sorts of aspects of social behavior, moral decision making. Oxytocin, of course, is a whole literature with that, and testosterone as well. So can maybe talk more about that in the discussion. But that's sort of where we leave off, and I think it's really only the beginning because these systems are incredibly complicated. I think it's really unlikely that we're going to have sort of a deep understanding of any one chemical system in the brain that's doing one thing. They do lots of things because, as you saw in the initial diagrams, like the neurons project to all over the brain, so of course they're going to be involved in a lot of things. So my final caveat is that I'm not making any claims about serotonin as being a moral molecule or anything like that. It's involved in lots of different things, but I just think it's really fascinating how this one chemical system in the brain seems to be really important for our social behavior and sort of the way that we interact with others in beneficial ways for ourselves and for them. So, thank you.
Thank you, Molly. So I'd invite any questions to come up and use the microphone.
If there's any time constraint in your experiments. In other words, if you speed up the decision making in automated games, whether you'll have any impact on the decisions that were made in terms of fairness, and whether there's any time for, I guess, serotonin secretion to be appropriate.
Yeah. So in all of our studies, we did impose a time limit on decisions, mainly so they could be appropriate for a brain imaging setting. But there is some really interesting work in behavioral economics showing that the amount of time you give someone to make one of these decisions can impact their decision making. So, for example, in the ultimatum game, there are a couple studies showing that if you give people more time, or indeed if you impose a time if you don't let them respond for 10 minutes or so, then they're more likely to accept unfair offers than when you allow people to respond immediately. So it definitely seems like the case that there are certain emotional processes that guide responding in these situations that are relatively short-lived. And if anything, I would think that neuromodulators would be particularly important for these more labile processes than something that's a really drawn-out reasoning process.
As a neuroscientist, I should know the answer to this. This is a biological type question. Is there evidence for any specificity in the serotonin system, like such as releasing to one part of the brain versus another, or is it more gland-like, or is it all or none? And also a little bit about the time dynamics of release and how long it stays around.
Yeah. So in terms of the distribution of serotonin in the brain, the neurons do project not to every area, to specific areas, and you can sort of look at where the receptors are and where the transporters are using PET imaging, for example, to see where in the brain there's a lot of serotonin. And it turns out that the same regions that are consistently implicated in social decision making, including the striatum, medial prefrontal cortex, amygdala, insula, these are all regions that are incredibly rich in serotonin transporters and receptors, and less so in more lateral regions of prefrontal cortex, for example. So I think it's not a coincidence that serotonin is implicated in so many social behaviors, and if you look at sort of the heat map of where serotonin is in the brain, and if you look at the brain regions that pop up in these sort of reviews of the social brain or whatnot, they're really strikingly overlapping.
I want to ask about the relationship between this work and work on discrete emotions. So where I have a bunch of data looking at induction of anger and induction of happiness, and they have very selective effects on moral judgment. So happiness is increasing, desire to engage in pro-social behavior, and also judgments about obligation. Anger is affecting harm and justice norms that have been discussed by a lot of previous speakers. And as he mentions about in closing, serotonin is affecting all kinds of things. And he is associated with anhedonia, it's also associated with aggression, which might be related to anger. So it's a kind of methods question. It's what's the advantage? Or why study a neuromodulator system that has such broad effects as opposed to discrete emotion work, which is looking at more specific effects?
So I think that the neurochemical modulation process is working on a somewhat different time course and at a different sort of computational level, if you will, than work on discrete emotions. So you might expect actually that the effects of discrete emotions on moral decision making would be different depending on the state of your serotonin system. So you might actually potentiate the effect of anger on moral decision making when serotonin levels are low, for example. We think of these neurochemical systems as sort of representing states in a sort of medium-term time course. So not on the really millisecond level time course of like glutamate neurotransmission, for example, and not on the really long-term time course of, say, traits or genetic polymorphism. So it's somewhere in between where you can imagine that neurotransmitter levels are sensitive to environmental variables like chronic stress or diet or sort of the amount of rewards or punishments that are around in the environment, and sort of placing the brain in a state that is adaptive for that environment, and influencing the way that the brain responds to discrete stimuli like emotion.
So just to repeat, so would it be then that this kind of research is not sort of explaining how moral judgments work, but individual differences and state-based differences that can affect moral judgments? So the emotion people can give us sort of a flow chart of how you arrive at a moral decision, and the neuromodulator people can tell us something about how broad populations have different baselines.
Yes, but I think that the models will work differently depending on the state of the chemicals in the brain.
it's not how the serotonin acts specifically that's causing what's going on. It's the fact that you have either increased or decreased communication between different parts of the brain. All right, so now, how do you then talk about these effects from that perspective? The fact that now we have more communication going on, why should that cause a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's precisely what we think is going on. In this particular study, it wasn't set up very well to look at connectivity effects, but we have another study using the same technique for depletion, looking at how serotonin levels influence communication between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex when you view signals of provocation, so angry faces, for example. And what we find is that when serotonin levels are sort of normal on placebo treatment, that when an angry face pops up, you see increased functional connectivity between amygdala and prefrontal cortex, suggesting that the prefrontal cortex is sort of downregulating activity in the amygdala. And this connectivity is completely reversed, broken down when tryptophan depletion takes place. So I absolutely agree that probably where the exciting sort of mechanistic explanations are going to come forth is when you look at how different brain regions communicate with each other and sort of use these different computational mechanisms to arrive at a decision output. And I absolutely think that neuromodulators like serotonin, like dopamine, are precisely working by influencing the connectivity between brain regions.
So if I can ask a follow-up question to that. So that it implies that we follow your research in some sense. We have a shot at delineating the neural circuitry that actually governs moral choice and moral behavior. And with regard to that, what's interesting, at least from the data that you've shown, some people have damage dorsal striatum or damage, cauda amygdala. Are those people known to be amoral, immoral, more moral, depending on how regulation goes?
So that's a great question. There aren't a whole lot of studies of people with cauda damage, mainly because that region is not in a part of the brain that tends to be affected by a lot of brain injuries. And of course, there's the larger issue of the fact that neuropsychological studies, lesion patients, these guys can have sort of compensatory mechanisms that fill in, and that brain regions like the caudate participate in part of the circuit, and knocking out one part of the circuit may or may not have effects on behavior. But I do know of one study where it was a case study of an individual with damage specifically to the head of the caudate, which is quite close to the region that we find, and his social behavior was abnormal. He was sort of, I think they tested him on some theory of mind tasks, for example, and some sort of moral conventional reasoning tasks, and he seemed to be abnormal relative to brain damage controls on those measures. But there just hasn't been a lot of studies on caudate patients in the domain of social cognition.
Okay, well, I'll take my privilege to ask one more question. So there are a lot of people on fluoxetine and other SSRIs amongst the people we interact with, and many of them have jobs as managers, and some of them have jobs as judges and such. And so should we be worried that those people, sometimes a psychiatrist gets the dosage right, so they get normal, but quite often it's a bumpy road to get the dosing right. So is that something to be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to do more research to really understand sort of how these drugs influence social decision making in the lab, and of course also out in the world. And yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot I think we can say based on the work that we've done, which used a single dose of an SSRI in healthy volunteers. And it's very difficult to extrapolate that to people who have some abnormality and are taking SSRIs over the long term. But I mean, I don't think it's a huge stretch to imagine that there could be sort of long-term effects of these drugs on moral decision making and social behavior. And yeah, also recognize that I think something like 10% of the population is or has been on an SSRI at some point. So I mean that is something that we should be considering when we think about these issues in a sort of broader context.
Well, in the interest of getting us closer to lunch, because we wouldn't want to be serotonin deprived.